welcome everyone, and bear with us if there's any technical glitches today. It's all extremely professional, but I'm also a total rookie with running a hybrid event with multiple speakers coming from lots of different places, and we don't have all of the presentations loaded up yet. We might have a late guest, so there might be a little bit of jiggery pokery, but I'm going to run through first of all a bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to introduce the first panel, and in the introduction I'm going to talk about the way the day is going to run, and so hopefully it'll become clear. So first of all, just want to welcome everyone to this event. So Industrial Revolution, Evolution, and it's a collaborative symposium. It's one day long. We'll finish at about 4:30, hopefully, 4 o'clock. And it's hosted by Monash University, Department of Architecture, and also University of the Arts, London. Everyone knows me, but maybe not absolutely everyone, because we have got guests from Italy. So my name's Mel Dodd, and I am Professor and Head of Architecture at Monash University in Melbourne. I want to introduce the day in 3 really quick ways. And by the way, there are some handouts here, Ruth. You could pass those around if people want some of the programme to have a look at. But firstly, I'm going to introduce the theme of today's event in Prato today. Second, I'm going to give a bit of background about the collaboration between Monash and University of the Arts London, who are a co-collaborator in this event with us, and some insights about why we did that. And finally, I'm going to run through the structure and objectives of the day before we kick off with the first panel. So in terms of the theme, what you can see on the screen, you might not be able to read it. I'll do a little bit of a summary, and excuse me reading. So what we know is that as developed countries deindustrialize, or rather they evolve their industries in response to globalization, new knowledge and creative industries based on advanced technologies are rapidly transforming how we use and operate cities. This not only impacts the way we work and interact, but also it presents new opportunities for creative and sustainable reinvention of our industrial built fabric in the transition towards more resilient urban environments. So this symposium really wants to explore how the regeneration of industrial areas can contribute more productively in this way to society and promote more integrated urban ecosystems, so retrofitting post-industrial spaces. We've got creative practitioners, researchers and policymakers actually from London, Melbourne, Prato, Milan and Florence, and they're going to discuss and present contemporary case studies, references and examples, where we might see industrial renewal as vehicles for social innovation, renewal and ecological repair even, reconsidering social, spatial and technological possibilities for generating new public value. So our speakers are going to offer insights into a range of things: experimental design methods, strategic urban frameworks, creative enterprise, alternative forms of practice that support the production of new inclusive economies, and hopefully with the aim of benefiting communities and the planet. So firstly, why this theme? Well, we are in Prato, and if you didn't know it already, and most people know this deeply, but Prato is one of the largest industrial districts in Italy, the largest textile centre in Europe, and one of the most important centres in the world, with over 7,000 companies in the fashion sector and about 2 billion euros of exports. So it's a really fantastically rich and interesting context in which to explore these sorts of questions. And this is precisely what we've been doing with all of you. So as a group of staff and students from Monash Architecture based at the Prato Centre, we've been running an intensive unit of study looking at the evolution of industrial built fabric across northern Italy, and a final 2 weeks looking at Prato specifically. So this symposium is a sort of conclusion to that unit of study for the students. And also, maybe as importantly, it's an opportunity to discuss and share the broader questions with a range of other external expert voices from the region and globally, in the hopes that also a very important point about this is that we would like to build collaboration in future, because this is something we can do year on year, and so that's where we're heading. Some quick background, and I need to keep myself on board with timing. Ruth, I'm aiming for a 13 minutes past 10 start to the session, so I've got 10 minutes. So some background for those who don't know. I'm going to do a bit of background on the two universities quite quickly, but just because I think it's important, because again, some of you are new and you don't know either university, and the students don't know much about one of the universities, which is University of the Arts London. So some background on our institutions, and perhaps some insights into why we're collaborating. So for those who don't know, Monash University is global research intensive university. It's the largest university in Australia, with campuses in Melbourne, KL, in Malaysia, Jakarta, Mumbai and Suzhou, and as well as obviously a major centre here in Prato, which is why we're here today. Monash Art Design and Architecture, or MADA as we know it, is one of 10 faculties at Monash, and it's a centre of creative practice encompassing architecture, design and fine art. Our research is really non-traditional, practice-based research and interdisciplinary, so it addresses societal challenges in real time. So we like to do projects and research through direct action and have some impact. And one of our key drivers is about reimagining cities. So understanding how we can contribute to the transformation of cities, understanding their complexity, and doing that through urban planning and policy, placemaking, public art, housing, transport, design for safety, and various understandings of urban culture. And alongside this, we also have other focuses on health and human experience and expansive visions and technologies. So it's pretty broad. But what I should say is we have 9 really substantial research labs which frame this work, including 3 that are located in architecture. And they are the Monash Urban Lab, Informal Cities Lab, and the Future Building Initiative. So that's Monash's labs, and maybe a little bit of insight into why we're interested in cities. Urban Lab is in particular, maybe this is a good example, provides really critical DNA for architecture, focuses on urban transformation, undertakes, as I said, practice-based research. The example here is just one of Urban Lab's projects, of which there's multiple. This is Gertrude Street Housing in St Albans, which is basically a project, a built project, multi-residential project that emerged from an Australian Research Council funded project with an industry partner who's a social housing provider called Housing Choices. This led to lots of initial research into typologies, studios with students, a little bit like this one, and then finally a completed architectural project by one of our practice professors, Nigel Bertram at NMBW. So this really is a project which rethinks design's contribution to housing with dignity for those disabled, aging in place, or wider challenges of densifying suburban areas. You can see this is about 7 apartments on a single normal suburban block. So that's the sort of work that we do. And I think it's not about industry, but it does give a sense of how we work. And so this is just a little bit more blurb about Urban Lab, and understanding that we do a lot of partnership and collaboration with local government, state government, industry and practice. I'm not going to talk about the broader ecosystem, but take from that slide what you will. There's lots of projects that we're running currently. This is just our current projects in Urban Lab and across the architecture, and broadly we're interested in this bigger idea of urban transformation. So the theme of industrial evolution and urban transition has been really core to Urban Lab for some time, led often by Leanne and Rutger, and we want to bring that research, went on too fast. And we want to bring that research into the Prato context with some like-minded partners, and the hopes that we can build further events, research and projects together. So that's Monash. University of the Arts, or UAL in London, is collaborating with Monash to offer this symposium, and we've also had a workshop with students this weekend. And the intention there is to really just kickstart an early stage of a broader partnership between our 2 universities in areas of mutual strength and interest. And again, for those who don't know, a brief introduction. UAL, or University of the Arts London, is number 2 in the world for art and design, which is quite staggering. It's a federation of 6 art colleges across London. So art colleges that are now sort of interconnected. That's Camberwell, Central St Martin's, Chelsea, London College of Communication, London College of Fashion. So a really large university focused very differently perhaps to Monash, which is a large science, technology, engineering university, but we have a common interest in creative practices. So UAL offers lots of courses across these sorts of domains. And importantly for this project and for Prato perhaps is that their courses include world famous fashion and textiles courses at London College of Fashion and Central St Martin's. And they also have the Centre for Sustainable Fashion. So one of the reasons for the collaboration is that we feel that our universities together addressing both industry and fashion and textiles could be a really interesting space. Colleagues with us today, Alex, Diana and Stephanie are going to talk later, but they are particularly this year from the Spatial Practices programme, which is based at King's Cross, which offers really innovative courses across architecture, cities and narrative environments. The Spatial Practices programme explores broader, I guess, expanded versions of what space and cities might be. And Monash and UAL, I think, have common strengths that intersect around urban and industrial transformation, addressing really the sort of hard built infrastructures of sustainable fabric, urban fabric, but also the soft infrastructures of operations, activities, experiences. And that's what we're interested in. So encouraging new ecologies and ecosystems. Finally, and not least, in terms of Central St Martin's and University of the Arts London more broadly, we should mention that Central St Martin's are a partner in a very large Horizon 2020 European project called T-Factor. Now, T-Factor is a project that seeks to look at the transformative potential of temporary use in industrial renewal, areas of industrial renewal. So it's particularly focused on temporary or meanwhile spaces and how those are rising across Europe, how they might be temporary sites for co-creative experimentation and kickstart longer, broader in co-creative renewal rather than just urban development for financial benefit. So this is about sharing public value and rewiring the possibilities of how temporary uses can feed into longer urban transformations. And the mission of T-Factor is to boost novel approaches to urban regeneration, focusing on the key role that temporary uses can play in making more inclusive, sustainable urban areas. So the partnership is very large. It's a direct action research project, which means projects are actually happening, and that's taking place across 6 early stage regeneration sites across Europe. These are called the pilots, and they range from London to Milan, Milan, London, Euston, and also Bilbao to Lisbon and Kaunas, I think, as well. And it's over 8 million in euros in funding. So it's a fairly big project. And it's another way in which we feel that this symposium is sort of bouncing off that project a little bit. And in particular, T-Factor's already studied some advanced cases of industrial regeneration using temporary use. And that's particularly been in King's Cross, which is exactly the area where Central St Martin's is located. And in fact, Central St Martin's has been instrumental in some of that temporary use, as well as Manifattura Tabacci, which all the Italian guests will probably know, which is quite local, really interesting. We visited it this week. So that's also something that's been studied. So I think in conclusion, given the synergies across Monash and UAL and with the local organisations that we have here today, including Anci Toscana, Lama and the City of Prato, we see this as a first step in a longer term collaboration based in Prato and expanding to include not only architecture, but also fashion, textiles, fine art and so on. So that's quite exciting. So to get on to today, and finally, yes, I'm going to close my mouth. This is our range. I'm not going to go through in detail. We're going to introduce our speakers as we go, but just to give you a sense that there's some amazing synergies across the speakers, and that's how we've made these synergies work. This is a conversation. Okay, this is a conversation about effectively what we might do next and giving some insights and an opportunity. So in some ways, it's quite an informal event. I know it looks formal, but perhaps it's an opportunity to meet and talk about some of these issues together. And look at what we could do next. I want to quickly then run through the structure of the day before we start the first panel. We've basically got 4 panels, with one panel being the students speaking back to us with some short videos which talk about their experiences of industry in Prato. Each panel has got a theme, and I'm going to, we've got a break a mid-morning break and a lunch break. We're running about 15 minutes late, so that's we'll just bear in mind those timings, but we're breaking at around 11:30, 11:40, and then at lunch at maybe 1:15. Closing probably around 4:15 latest. So what I'm going to quickly go on to next is introduce the first panel so that we can get our speakers up one by one. The format is broadly that we're doing quite short trigger talks. So they're 15 minutes, which is quite a short time. And we've got 4 speakers in each panel. So that's ambitious. So 15-minute trigger talks and then an opportunity for some discussion after. And this first panel I'm going to chair. The second panel will be chaired by Leanne from Monash, and the fourth panel will be chaired by Alex from Central St Martin's. So I'm chairing this panel, so I'll try and operate the technology, she says, looking for the e-solutions person anxiously. But very quickly, this is a panel that, if you like, starts at the level of policy, territory, complex systems and strategy. So what we're interested in is how transitioning across the industrial space of urban areas requires big visions and systematic change, and how architects, policymakers, researchers, and so on are looking at this. So very large strategic level frameworks. We have, I think we have a cancellation. Okay, so Valerio, that's a good excuse for Valerio. So the students will understand my wry smile. So he's not late, he's got COVID. Okay, fair enough. That's sad. That's sad for Valerio and sad for us. We've heard a lot from Valerio this week, but it's a shame that our guests can't hear from him. Just so in his absence, he's the Deputy Mayor of Urban Planning at the Commune of Prato. He's responsible for some fairly amazing projects, but he's also a professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Florence locally. He's the coordinator of the Partnerships on the Circular Economy for the EU Union Agenda and the co-founder of MDU Architecti. So Valerio's got a very important role and a vision for Prato as a circular city based on its industrial richness and the challenges that it's facing in its textile industry, as well as a greening and sort of urban foresting agenda. So I'm sad that we can't hear from him. The students are lucky enough to have heard from him this week, so that's good. So I will introduce quickly the other guests. We have, first of all, David Fanfani. Maybe wave your hand, David. David explores cross-disciplinary, bioregional and coevolutionary relations between urban and rural domains. He's currently Associate Professor, Urban and Regional Planning at DiDA in the University of Florence and Chief Editor of Contesti, Città, Territori e Progetti. So David will speak first, and the second, so I'm going to introduce all the speakers now so we can just do quick moves between. But we've already gained 15 minutes because Valeria's not coming. Win, loss. Next, we have Antonella Bruzzese. Antonella is an architect and urban planner. She's Associate Professor at DAS2 at the Polytechnic of Milano. And she's a former city councillor in urban planning at the District 3 of Milan, and examines urban design in relation to urban policies and participatory practices, focusing on public space and placemaking strategies. And finally, we have Leanne, Khor and Rutger Pasman. We know them well, but I'll introduce them here. They're architectural academics and practitioners in the Urban Lab at Monash Architecture, working with industry and government partners to develop design models for more affordable, sustainable housing and urban precincts. So I think what I'll do is just get David's presentation up.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to the Monash University for the kind invitation to take part in this workshop. First of all, I have to apologize for my weak English speaking, and I hope I'm able to express with the sufficient clearly my reflections. So, first of all, I interpreted the very interesting topic proposed for this workshop about the recovery of the resilience built environment in former industrial built environment, urban built environment, approaching this topic relating to the recovery of the former industrial territory, conceived as a whole that encompass both urban fabric as well as peri-urban and agricultural areas, and featured with very original and not completely urban and built features. Sorry to advance.
Oh, sorry, we can use this one here, or you can use the
Okay.
Might not be, it might be.
Thank you so much. To try to focus on this approach, I firstly have to put some premises referring to our way to conceive, the way we have conceived the development and industrial development, relating to the role of the cities that, according to the capitalistic model of development, since from the outset, detached for their surrounding region in terms of provision of energy, of matters, that relating to the free and very cheap provision of energy related to the fossil age. So, but this is, if at the beginning could be conceived as an opportunity, with the centuries, it reveals be a weakness, because in terms of dependency of the cities needed to be provided by long supply chain that make the cities very few autonomous and not fragile, and that undergone the risk of the evolution of particular political, geopolitical, and then lately climate change situation. So to rethink about resilient cities, probably we need to rethink how to shorten this long supply chain that make fragile and not resilient south built environment, and to starting from the urban environment, conceived as an environment that occupy also a large part of the planet, not only physically, but as Brenner Schmidt stated, also in terms of the immaterial and power relationship. In these terms, peri-urban areas became very important, as underlined by some contribution related to the concept of a pericene stated by Joe Ravets in his book The Wise City, or the Regional City. And we have to, according with many policy statements, but also with many studies, we have to recover the relationship, the coevolutionary relationship between urban and rural environment and surrounding region of the urban. And in this term, we need, and I guess this issue fully resonates the approach of this seminary, an integrated and cross-disciplinary and cross-scale approach. That means we can try to deal with policies and design issues, either at the small scale, but trying to follow a general vision. In this approach, we can find some, we can find some support, at least in my research experience, relating to the bioregional and bioregional approach that draws on the regional legacy of the Regional Planning Association of America, the studies of Patrick Geddes, and an approach that stresses particularly the relationship between the city, the urban environment, the energy and the matter supply of a region, and according with the disposal, according with the provision and endowments of the surrounding regions. And it is an approach that we look at not as a sort of ideological prospect, but as a guide for the action to be implemented as a paradigm in an incremental and grassroots and cooperative approach, and according with the cross-scale approach that I spoke about before. And it is an approach, how you can see looking at the schemes drawn by Bob Tyre, that won the outstanding living exponent of a bi-regional planning approach, that is especially aimed to shorten this goods, energy, matter, and general supply between regions, try to develop a cooperative rather than a competitive relationship between regions and cities. That entails some changing in our approach to peri-urban areas, and especially the recovery of a long-lasting territory forms of the natural and built environment, especially referred to the heritage or the so-called patrimony, and of contextual vernacular skills and knowledge. In terms of policies, it translates on enhancing biodiversity and soil ecological function, supports of local markets and fair self-led place-based economies, referring to, for instance, to the bi-regional economies text of Molly Scott Cato, underpinned especially on short supply chains and especially the recovery of local food system, addressing either environmental, socio-economic, and cultural values. Finally, in terms of design and planning, this approach calls for the design at various scales and encompassing also rural development and environmental policies that conceive urbanism as a sort of agroecological urbanism that in such a way flip up the relationship between urban and rural domain. Now I came to pose this kind of framework. I came to present the special application that we tried to do of these statements and approach, referring to the idea and this tool of peri-urban agricultural parks that we experimented also with the grassroots action in Prato. Peri-urban parks are some kind of tools developed especially in Europe, starting from the experience of Barcelona and Milan, and it is not so formalized kind of tools, but is a sort of figure and of hybrid governance that, notwithstanding, allows to join and to merge together either spatial issues and development socio-economical goals. In the context of the Florence metropolitan area, we experimented this practice, starting from a double approach. The first is formal, relating to the creation of the agricultural park led by Tuscany region, especially even though by the involvement on the social activists, producers, and association, environmental association, but this kind of tools is formally established with an act of Tuscany on behalf of Tuscany region in 2014. The point is that this kind of park lacks of veritable and active action from below, with involvement and ordinary involvement of the different social economic actors. And it turned out being a weakness of this park that so far is not really implemented. It remains as a formal establishment, but not as a real policy action to be implemented. So in this context, the area of Prato is one of the important part of this park, because both the consistency of the rural and farmland areas, and because the interest of the patterns, spatial patterns between built urban fabric and peri-urban areas, that allows us to either to reframe the nature and the action of the peri-urban farming, but at the same time to conceive the role of the open spaces as a sort of counter mold for the built environment. And as you can see, this kind of area is very complex, but with a strong presence, still a strong presence of farming areas, and leaded with also with a professional approach that is a sort, if for on the one hand is a problem, because sometimes conventional architecture and agriculture is very polluting and harmful for the environment. On the other hand, it allows us to think a shift of this kind of agriculture towards a more nature-based kind of practice. And in this context, we witnessed a lot of new sort of back to the farmland movement, I called it, in terms of innovative and sustainable farming, especially aimed to constitution of short food supply chain, and with a very deep ethic and social inspiration on behalf of the farmers, on these new farmers. And in this context, starting from 2013, we, as a researcher in action, with relating to the national research project about agricultural parks on behalf of the architecture department, we supported and ignited a path of farmers' involvement to create, according with the bioregional and vision, according with the selective regional closure, as stated by Storer and Todelind, a short food with supply chain aimed to enhance legacy and skills of this territory related to with cultivation, bakery transformation, and meals presence. And this with the goal to produce a sort of supply chain that based on the fairness, especially relating to the fair price paid to the farmers, and a sort of a value redistribution along the chain of values. And this experience had a good success, because this is the goals of the chain. This chain is still living. We celebrated some years this year 10 years of the chain. Even though with some obviously with some problems, but if at the beginning, for instance, in terms of resilience, speaking of resilience, at the beginning, it allows to deal with the too much low prices for farmers. Now, it allows us to cope with the higher prices of wealth in the international markets. So this is an exemplification, I guess, of resiliences relating to bioregional production and enhancement of peri-urban areas approach. It encompasses 10 farms at the moment, 14 bakeries, 38 sites of retails, 19 restaurants, and farmer markets, manifold farmer markets in this area. And the production also especially during the pandemic, was increasingly high, and at the moment it allows also for the existence of the mill itself, because the crisis of the sector. And I'm going to close. I apologize for because I'm so long. Just to resume some final thoughts that synthesize the things I said. Recovery of agrosystems surrounding and still interwoven with cities are worth for the recovery of resilience and the equitable pattern of urbanization in the transition age. The bioregional approach, as you have heard, allow us to in this kind of vision, and but it ignites a demand for innovation in urban planning and design, and an economic approach as well, assuming a cross-disciplinary methodology, as well as a design and development program based on grassroots cooperation and inclusive action. Construction of short supply chain is worth in this approach, because it perfectly with the need to reapproach urban fabric and surrounding urban region in the according ecological, sustainable, and place-based economic model suitable for transition and resilience. So far, nonetheless, ordinary design and implementation of such an approach still finds some obstacles in the path-dependent development vision of the local policies that are not always aware of this kind of demands, and especially of the demands that from below comes from a territory. Thanks so much, and apologies for my English.
Thanks so much, David. That was a fantastic start from a bioregional agro ecosystem approach. Awesome. Gives us the top ambition. Next up we have Antonella.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. I will bring you in a completely different kind of environment in Milano, and in a place that I know that some of you have visited, even if for a short time. So my reflection on today are some thoughts that I want to share with you about recent regeneration processes in Milan. And I start. Sorry, I don't know how to go ahead.
It's down here. It's this
one. Okay.
Here.
I was touching the. Okay, I would start with the premises of this symposium that I've read, and I I was underlying some of the words that are written there that are particularly familiar to me and to my work. And I found very interesting and something that is related to what I had the possibility to look at both as a researcher. I'm an associate professor in urban planning and urban design at the Politecnico di Milano, but I had the possibility to work as a councillor, assessore, deputy mayor actually in urban planning in one of the 9 districts of Milan in the past 5 years. So my point of view on the topic is not only the one of a planner and a researcher, but the one that is trying to deal with the public interest. And so in a specific part of Milano that I will show you, because I will start and talk about a bit about that area. So what happened in the past is that we have seen, especially in Milano, some approaches to post-industrial renewal that is often extractive and exploitive, as have been said. And the result is homogeneous residential development. And these words are exactly what we can see in one of the examples I will show you. And what we need, and I think is interesting to arrive after the previous presentation, because I'm gonna talk about a more integrated urban ecosystem and social innovation, ecological repair in terms of what we need and what we have seen. It was exactly an example of trying to achieve a more integrated urban ecosystem. But what is interesting me most is to generate public value. So my question and my starting point is what is public value and how we can generate it in the field, of course, that we are reasoning about. So industrial transformation. So I'm try to tell you something about the neighborhood of Lambrate in Milano, because it's an interesting place, because there we can find a sort of catalog of different regeneration processes along years. For those who are a bit familiar with Milano, you can see in the I don't know where, okay, the Duomo, so the very center, and the Lambrate, which is in the periphery, in the eastern part of periphery, and you can immediately understand the different kind of urban tissue, some presence of urban industrial plants, and the different kind of urban tissue there. Another picture, another aerial view of the city and that specific part, and what happened in the past and what is happening now. It will be what I'm going to show you in a minute. So we are close to the railway, and it was a former different municipality detached from Milano, and it became especially in the 50s, one of the main places where a lot of big and medium-sized industrial plants were located. In particular, the number 5 and 6 that you see here is Faema or Innocenti Maserati. The number 6, I'm talking a bit about it. And you see that the presence, the closeness to the railway yard and the railways was, of course, the reason of this industrial vocation of the place. What happened? You can easily imagine that there is a strong process of decentralization and relocalization of activities, and a lot of places in Lambrate started to be abandoned and reused. And some figures, you can find some numbers numbers, but just to tell you that the amount of places that were without any use for a long time was impressive there. I'm gonna talk very briefly, of course, about different cases that happen along the years. So starting from the 80s with the ex Innocenti Maserati, a big plant, in 2000 with the ex Faema, arriving to a very recent kind of transformation process and with different processes and different kind of needs also. Ex Innocenti, the words that can identify the characteristics, the features of this process was a big intervention, mainly residential, that produce an homogeneous and environment according to a sort of zoning of the area without any experimentation and according to a national program using a tool of Programma di Riqualificazione Urbana. You see here the big plant and the ex Innocenti that was a big plant that was producing in at the beginning during the 30s the pipes, the tubi Innocenti used for construction sites. Then in the 50s, it was the plant where the Lambretta was produced, and in 1993 they arrived to the closure. And you see this huge plant. And what happened with the first kind of approach at the beginning of the actually the 2000 was to delete the memory of the industrial presence, arriving to have a homogeneous residential neighborhood with big blocks and big condominium squares and commercial activities. Another example that show us a different kind of approach and a different process of transformation, transforming the former industrial buildings was what happened. It's what happened in Lambrate Ventura. It's an interesting process that was related also with the Fuori Salone, temporary uses, and a different, an interesting process without the intervention of the public administration, but all privately led by private investors. We are in a different but close part of the same neighborhood. And these are the kind of tissues, so smaller in terms of dimensions and urban fabrics. And what happened in the background, we see that Milano has a strong presence of creative clusters and creative production. And in the half of the 90s until I would say a few years ago, Lambrate became a place where this cluster linked to the temporary activities of Fuori Salone were particularly relevant. And what happened is that beside the transformation of the buildings, small industrial buildings like Faema. Faema was an important brand producing coffee machines, and it had its production relocated, and there with a process quite typical of arrival of a creative, let's say not creative class, but creative creative entrepreneurship and people that start to have their art galleries and studios. They start to host temporary events during the design week, and they started at the same time working between physical transformation and the production of a sort of new brand, a new reputation of the area, attracting different events and temporary uses. In the area, the possibility to have their temporary uses were quite relevant, because as you see here, all of them were abandoned building this map is back on 2015. Now things are changes, but at that time there was a lot of space that could be used for temporary uses. And you see here what happened in different times. So now in the places where temporary uses have been hosted, the transformation occurring are mainly residence and luxury houses. So the point is we had one model from the past, the big plant in Ex Innocenti. We had a model more complex and more integrated, but now the process is continuing with a model that is aiming at having residence and luxury houses. So the point is not only how we can avoid monofunctionality, but also what can define public value. And this list try to underline what, from a specific perspective, what we can define as public value. Thinking about Lambrate, mixed uses and mixed city, good quality and well-connected public space, urban function in periphery, services for all, affordable houses, openness to the local communities, is something are different possible declination of public value. So very briefly, because I have still 2 minutes, I will show you 2 different processes ongoing now in Lambrate that somehow are dealing with this issue of public value. And the first one is the project of a student house in Trenta Coste. Is always in the same surroundings, just a bit closer to the railway in the southern part, a small lot where an operator, a private investor arrived and proposed this kind of intervention. This was the former proposal that's proposed in this way, just with the project of the lot, without any attention to what was in the surroundings and the relationship with the context. This project has been we refused as district, but also as a municipality. And so the operator had to come back. And we started, I say we, because at that time I was deputy mayor. And so I had the possibility to discuss with them. And with another operator, we started to a dialogue between the operator and in that case, the institution, try to discuss which kind of needs the neighborhood had, and which kind of relationship had to be taken into account. So these are some other drawings and reflection and analysis that the operator started to do, always having this interesting relationship with us. At the end, he arrived with this this concept that organized the space in a different way, even if the volume are the same, but the public space is connected to the rest of the neighborhood, and We obtained the fact that a cafeteria was open to the public and not only for the students. It was not only a wall, but something more visible and permeable at the ground floor. And the public space aimed at creating more relationship with the surroundings. So interaction with the institution and understanding the context. Very quickly, I show you the last example, which is always in the same part, but is the same, actually, former plant, Innocenti, but the last part, because you see here what was realized with the residential area, but the last part was not realized yet. What happened is that the Comune di Milano, the municipality of Milano, included that area that was stopped for more than 20 years in the so-called grande funzione urbana. It means big urban function. So decided to put there one important function, such as the deposit of La Scala, the big theater that you know, that now is in another part of Milano. And this was an interesting approach to bring an important an urban function in the periphery. So a framework agreement, the reorganization of the ownership in order to have the possibility I skip things, in order to have the possibility to arrive to set up an architectural competition, international competition called La Magnifica Fabbrica. In Milano, Magnifica Fabbrica was the process to build the Duomo, no? Because it lasted centuries actually. And so the international competition for the place of Innocenti, because we have this important building that is quite effective in terms of space, but not used anymore. So the winning project is this one. Doesn't matter, but we can discuss about the quality of architecture. But what was important is the fact that the process was definitely much more complex, related to the urban strategies. And even in that case, in the dialogue with the municipality and the district, we obtained the possibility to have functions open to the local communities, and not only a sort of citadel, introverted and not having any dialogue with the context, and to bring urban functions quite relevant in the periphery. I conclude with this image because this was the past of the industrial, the image of the industrial past of Milano, and we hope to learn from this kind of processes. And thank you for the attention.
Thanks. That was fantastic, Antonella. Next, we've got Leanne and Rutger, and they're our last speakers.
Okay, well, we thought we would introduce Melbourne a little bit. And to do so, we thought of comparing the Prato plain, which we learned recently doesn't have a real name, so Firenze Prato Pistoia plain, to scale with Melbourne's setting. And Melbourne's setting sits on the southern side of the Great Dividing Range, which you see here in the north, and the Bass Strait in the south, and in between is this lowlands, a sunkland, in which Melbourne sits. And then if you can see on the eastern and western side, there's quite clear escarpments, which really form the basin of Melbourne. The city sort of sits within that basin. Some bits are on the hills. And and most importantly, sort of post-war, most of it is residential development in a very low density. The dark gray spots are sort of large industrial clusters, and in a future sort of development atmosphere, these are probably the areas that most development will happen, because the residential development is so fragmented that it's almost impossible to develop. Melbourne as a city is therefore fairly flat, with a concentrated center, and currently has about 5.1 million people. About 31% are born overseas, and there's a strong Chinese community. In the recent data that was released last week, there's a trend to a more Indian and Pakistani heritage. The big issue in Melbourne is that we will double the population in the next 30 years. And in that sense, we've been working with the Urban Lab to start to try and understand new structures. And where traditionally we've looked at Melbourne as a historical city, or a city with a center, and then maybe a series of smaller centers around that city. And at some point in the policy, that became so many that nobody knew what a center actually was. The transport, it has a very centralized kind of spider web. That means that everybody that wants to go somewhere needs to come to the city and then go back out again. We started to look at sort of spatial assemblies, and particularly in this idea of the institutions and kind of where people operate, because not everybody comes to the city. And they became sort of these large 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer structures. And I'll talk through one of them relatively quickly. So here's one of those structures. There's on the eastern side, there's two university campuses, a larger older industrial estate, a shopping center, a large shopping center, and a hospital. There's an old town called Preston, which has some kind of historical character. And then there's sort of a civic hub in this territory. And what we started to do is start to reformulate, say, spatial combinations. In this case, we assumed, okay, the university could become like a knowledge landscape between the two universities. And then by adding an industrial crown to one of the industrial estates, we can then start to speculate about sort of startup businesses, etc., that came through that cluster. And then on closer look and redrawing that, we actually found a whole series of landscapes and functions and places that started to feed into that. So it started to strengthen sort of this quite strange north-south band that wasn't on a corridor or on an axis, and create something new. In a similar way, we then looked at an east-west connection, which is a very strong singular corridor at the moment, and we started to think about maybe a double corridor with some space in between. We called it an urban ladder, and in which maybe multi-speed development could happen, where larger developments could happen on the main corridor, but maybe more neighborhood type of developments could happen on the second corridor. And once we start to overlap these things as spatial structures, there's sort of the amplification that starts to happen in multiple levels. Looking then back on the ground and sort of, okay, let's go out and see what it actually is. These are the type of landscapes we see. And we then started to make a series of images that started to go, okay, well, maybe instead of having a big piece of infrastructure, just a cycling route, major cycling corridor, could ignite sort of less obvious sites. And particularly if we start to think about small, possibly temporary public space transformations. Or a bus instead of the train could then sort of unlock the shopping center as a place, as a real center. And then interestingly, sort of the intersections became really quite, I don't know, opportunistic. And then Leanne will.
Smooth transitions. So this was a project, the research that Rutger was showing was a sort of an ARC linkage with Melbourne University, but a number of state and local government representatives. And so as we were nearing the end of that project, we were sort of really encouraged that a couple of policies had started coming out. So this was roughly back in 2014 was when it was sort of raised as a bit of a discussion paper and then sort of instituted in 2017. And that was for these sort of cluster policies at two different scales. One was this National Employment and Innovation Cluster, and the other was the sort of 20-minute neighbourhood. So these NICs, the National Employment and Innovation Clusters, are very large territories, and what's sort of exciting about those was that it was a sort of a new way to look at city or think about city making. So it's about 7 kilometres from the top to the bottom of this diagram, about 5 kilometres across. And we thought that there were quite a few synergies with some of the research that we were doing. But, you know, more than 5 years later, the policies have remained largely at the level of rhetoric. So there's not been very much kind of movement, let's say, around plans for implementation. And the 20-minute neighbourhood, when it was originally released, was perhaps a more ambitious idea about how we could rethink time and connectivity as networks. And there's been a sort of a strong reversion to that 1950s neighbourhood centre model. So there's been a little bit of a retreat, and ultimately things like the NEEC then just become a bit of a lasso around what's already there. So the hospital's already there, the university is already there, and there's a bit of a question of, well, now what? So part of the research that we're doing around industrial revolution is that perhaps there's a recognition that it's not the policies themselves that are at issue, it's the fact that we sort of lost this spatial intelligence around the suburbs. So this image is the metropolitan area in 1968 in Melbourne. The kind of light orange is the metropolitan boundary at the time, and then the funny shapes in there are the 7 NEECs that are proposed across the metropolitan area. And 5 of those 7 NEECs are essentially in these sort of what were fringe locations as it quickly sped past, and they become sort of middle locations, which is sort of super interesting for us in the sense that the way that Melbourne's population is growing and exploding in some senses, with a bit of a blip for COVID, that these places are relatively well serviced. And so if we look at just one sort of area, this is what was happening in Monash Clayton. So this is the university back when it was being developed in the 60s. So very, very much a fringe area, but the amount of investment that happened through this post-war era means that they are very well serviced comparatively to the fringe locations that we're sprawling into, let's say, but also offer a lot of opportunity then for a bit of diversity and also cultural identity that perhaps the models that are needed economically in the city don't allow for. So there's sort of a huge amount of potential in these middle areas, if only we gave them a bit of design attention. So this is the kind of fabric that we have today. So of course the kind of fringe filled in, and this middle area is a bit ad hoc. It's not very well planned. It all sort of just happened quite rapidly. These 2 highlighted areas are in the Monash NEEC, not too far away from the university, one called M-City, which was an old sort of furniture type of a homemaker centre. pretty low value in its kind of built form, and another is the PMP printing factory, probably high cultural value and also potentially architectural value. So there are these sorts of questions about what we can do in these areas, but we don't perhaps understand enough about the fabric. And I think that in a way, there's it's beyond these sort of one-off bang for your buck type sites. It's about these funny intersections or interfaces that happen between the collision of residential and industrial, or these work areas, or the funny networks of roads and rail that start to collide and intersect. But because, I guess, in some senses, we're reverting a little bit to what we know, this is the type of outcome that we're getting at MCity. So again, both in some senses, what Antonella was starting to talk about, it's not giving a hell of a lot back to the public realm. What it is doing, though, is providing things like hotels and another level of diversity of housing that's needed for these areas, particularly for some of the institutions that are trying to invite visitors and those sorts of things into these clusters. But it is all about sort of scale, potentially not about quality, and that kind of bang for your buck approach to speculative development sort of rings true. And even though there is a kind of an economic equation here, it's potentially not giving back, or it's a bit of a lost opportunity about what it could be giving back to the community that already exists there. And so I think it's sort of important to remember that there are communities that already exist there. These aren't tabula rasa sites that the gentrification process just happens to. And this is just to sort of reinforce that kind of lost opportunity. Creative Spaces is just a sort of a website in Melbourne. Look up kind of shared studios or places for events, and you come back with 2 places listed in these kind of areas. So our research in the sort of industrial revolution area has started to collaborate with urban historians and economic historians at Monash to let's unpack in a way the kind of historical value of these undervalued areas, and think about what it is that we can do in both a sort of an identity building way, but also then an interesting spatial way. And so things like the innovation of technology for that era were really quite important in things like the printing companies in these areas, but also things for like bringing the females into the workforce, or increasing opportunities for female workforce at that time. So, our component of this is bringing perhaps the kind of pretty typical spatial analysis, but once you do start to dig into these areas, we start to realize then that the ad hoc doesn't stop at that urban level, it really continues through to a site level. And there's a lot of kind of underutilized space just in the car parking, or the way that the sites have kind of incrementally grown or developed over time. But there is also quite a bit of cultural value, and so the Volkswagen factory, which is a little bit further south, is a really important part of this area, not only in terms of the scale of this thing, which competes in some ways with the Clayton campus as a bit of a hole in the landscape, but also for the kind of skilling and technology, but also community building that these kind of companies brought to these fringe and developing areas. But if we do fast forward, then there is, of course, this kind of continuous challenge about what we do with these very vast, big scaled buildings. Not only in terms of the physical scale of these things, but then the physical scale of operations like logistics that we're moving into, for example. Another issue with these territories, particularly with the NEECs, is this sort of multiple jurisdictions are always involved. And so on the right there, I don't know if I can use the mouse, but that's the Volkswagen factory there. It sits right on the edge of 3 different jurisdictions. And so the City of Kingston wants it to become housing, the City of Monash wants it to be work. And to be honest, Greater Dandenong, it's on the very, very western edge of it. It's local area, and they kind of actually don't care. So the coordination, or the kind of getting the integration of inputs becomes quite a challenge with these NEECs. So again, trying to sort of think about a role perhaps for design, about how we can take on these parameters or take on these tensions and flip them on their head a little bit. And, part of that is change over time. Part of that is the kind of underutilization of different areas. But part of that is also about speculating about what it could become beyond something like MCity, let's say. And in the end, for us, it's our students that potentially have the best capacity for this speculative thinking, not only because they're young and energetic, but because this is going to be their workplaces, and potentially in some ways, they are going to be the professionals realizing it. And so beyond the stuff that you will see from the unit that these guys are doing today, this was just a recent studio we ran. And so Liam Ware was accepting in some senses the gentrification that's going to happen, taking on the material fabric and documenting that, and thinking about a direct reuse of what that might be. And so I think in a way, you know, that we might talk about that as a sort of a circular urbanism. But there's this type of curious cannibalization of the fabric to rebuild itself going on in this, which is, I guess, just one way of thinking slightly differently to the conventional proposals. So we'll stop there, but I think in a sense, it's sort of a bit of a call to arms, that there is a sort of a role for speculative design as evidence making, which I think is sometimes perhaps lost in our disciplines, when the quantification and some of the more typical ways of thinking about evidence trumps us, let's say, in these locations. Thanks.
I guess we can take some questions, and maybe what I'll do is just kick off with a sort of some observations. I don't know if I can make them into questions yet, because there's so much going on in my head. But yeah, so build up to a question if you want to, and the more communication that we do across the border of the screen, the better. So thanks so much. That was excellent. I mean, what I felt, we obviously deliberately started at the level of like urban planning and policy, because I guess that's one of the places that real action might happen. And many of you talked about the issues of policy not being put into practice, policy as rhetoric, and started to infer that there were, you know, ways around or workarounds for how that might work better in different spaces in different places. But one of the things that I thought I'd just ask you all is this particular panel. I think we're all architects. Maybe David's an urban planner.
I'm an architect.
Okay, so we're all architects.
Turned in planner.
Turned planner. And indeed, Antonella's an architect turned councillor in the planning department, and this is also what Valerio was. And we have architects doing active research in urban planning. So I'm sort of interested in this role of how I think we might retrieve these lost intelligences. I think you referred to it, Leanne, and it was sort of latent in all of the talks, and what the role of architecture is further upstream, and how you think those sorts of intelligences, whether they be typological, spatial, or whether they be sort of operational innovation and improvising, how we work with operators, as you talked about, Antonella, how much you think it's important architects move upstream to make some of these things work a bit better. And even, I mean, I think just to final my question, David was the sort of most, fantastically sort of bio-regional stage. And so it'd be great to hear from all of you about that. If you think that that's something you've discovered in your own practice is an important attribute that you bring, a spatial or, let's say, experiential education, as opposed to a data or planning policy background.
In some ways, it's probably got the most experience.
Maybe so that the Zoom people can hear, just bear in mind those things might want to come forward.
I can say something, just reacting to your comments. I always think that space matters. Space matters because all the transformations that we have start from spatial opportunities, and especially in this field where we have to deal with different kind of space and that suggest a different kind of opportunities and a different kind of process. My only point is that it's important to keep in mind other scales, not only in terms of other scales of, in terms of interaction between the single space with the rest of the city, the neighborhood, the people living there, but also in terms of which kind of premises are at the base of the possibilities to transform that specific space. So I think that it's important for architects to keep in mind, let's say, wider scales in terms of the consequences and in terms of what is needed in order to make the transformation more effective. And not only space, but also uses, but we have already talked about it. Just a few words.
Well, if I well understood the question, first of all, I have to stress how the approach that I try to follow, that proposing research and action, is not ideological. As I try to explain, is an approach that the regional approach is mainly based on actions, starting mainly from even if with a vision, obviously, as you correctly stated. And I guess the point is about the relationship between actions and politics. The question is how we can enhance the relationship between place awareness construction in a bi-regional approach and then resilience pursuing resilience and how we can enhance this relationship between community involvement that is not a natural fact, because communities mainly doesn't exist or very often, and we have newcomers, we have new inhabitants, and how we can improve on behalf of them the place awareness and the sense of stewardship about places, because I guess it is the matters. And sometimes public policies are related. We can really well understand that to the mainstream approach. So we have to improve this kind of relationship, acting on both sides, I guess, on behalf of public sector, and that is mainly sector confined very often, and on behalf of inhabitants, because they often, and we often, don't have enough knowledge about and a complete knowledge about the problem we have to deal with. I found very interesting the statement of I'm aware that is very old, but of Benton McKay, that spoke about the planner as a sort of revealer that is able to hear about local knowledge, about the experience of the places, and to construct a project, to construct a sort of implicit project that is in the place that we have to be able to put at the light in cooperation with people. So for me, the point of politics, the relations with policies is posed in obviously we have to, when I was asking seeing your presentation, and I was wondering myself, what can I do in this condition, this situation? And probably we have to cope with different situations at the proper scale, and trying to reconstruct some dimensional and relation and provision relationship at the proper scale, I guess.
Right. Yeah, yeah, go for it.
And I think it's so inheriting this speculative design is evidence and elaborate specific speculation is created in what we don't think that necessary.
And you can correct me perhaps if I get it wrong. So the question was that it was encouraging that speculative design is seen as a type of an evidence building, and asking for an example, a specific example of what kind of speculation. So the project that Rutger was showing was a type of a speculation. It was design research in that sense, and so I think the specifics around what that was were things like ladders and the type of fat corridors and those sorts of proposals in a way. And there were sort of a range of those at a multi-scalar kind of nesting in a sense. And so I think that sort of interestingly, it goes back a little bit to what Antonella was saying, that some of those ladders and some of those strategies are potentially not unfamiliar to some of the architects in the room, but I think that the speculation of then reapplying it to a specific context and having to unpack that, I think as well, in some senses, then working with the group of collaborators with state and local government. The speculation happened then in terms of, well, how could we do this? So there's sort of one step of envisioning something, and then there's another step of what the parameters are or the inputs are to potentially sort of go, okay, so how do we shift the status quo? I think that in some of the other research that we've done in the urban lab, that's happened at a housing level where the kind of status quo is a type of a turning over of a single house into a dual occupancy or a number of units. And the speculation was just sort of like, well, what happens if we coordinate this and treat it like a precinct? What other public realm kind of opportunities come up? What can we do with car parking? All of these sorts of things. So once we sort of rejig one or two of those parameters, then actually the fabric and the structure completely changes. And so again, I think just going back to Mel's first question, for me, it's sort of imperative that architects work across scales so that they can come upstream in a way. So I think David's work in terms of bioregional sort of stuff demands us to understand that kind of scale of thinking. And I think that, I guess the part of that is that potentially in Melbourne, there's a little bit of a difference to what urban planning is here as opposed to what it is in Melbourne, which I think has traditionally been much more economically driven. And I think urban design is now only starting to come to a type of a fore. So I think that idea of speculation, or perhaps trying to connect the two questions in a way, I think that the idea of design speculation and what design can offer so that we don't get stuck in these sort of policies that don't go anywhere, we're very good at doing that kind of stuff. What we're not necessarily good at is then sort of, we need other people to kind of be able to put it into place.
Yeah.
We've probably got, I've got a mic and we've got a chance for another audience question, real life. Does anybody have a burning, yes?
Speculation. Is there any space for middle? Is there any space for speculation? It's not spatial all stages.
I would almost say that I think there is a space for it, but I'm not sure if it's a formalized space, but there's definitely a need for it. And I think the moment we started in this speculative project, we started to make these drawings, suddenly all that local knowledge came out, and suddenly the policy became a site-specific policy. So I think by doing the work, we sort of create a need, let's say that.
May I? It's a pity that, okay, for the time, I couldn't tell you more about the experience of Trentacoste, because I think that that was really a special occasion and a special opportunity that we had, quite rare, because it's not common, to collaborate between the architect and the political part. That in that case, it was me. That actually it was a strange political, because I'm an architect too, and so my background, we were talking the same language, but I was bringing there on the table the knowledge, the deep knowledge of the neighborhood, and the possibility with the architect to talk and to work with us was a way to make their project definitely more related to not only the spatial structure at the wider scale, but also to the need of the population, the local community. Even if when you make a project, you don't have to answer only to the actual needs, but you have to think about the future needs. But somehow there should be a link between and try to find a balance between these different things. So in my opinion, that was a good experience, but it's not common. It's not common because it's definitely more common what happened at the beginning. So the investor arrived just without any knowledge of the place, of the needs. They propose their project, and that's it. And this is sometimes definitely a bad situation and with bad consequences.
Yes, I had no time to cope with design issues and project approach, but it is when we approach the problem of peri-urban areas planning jointly with the urban areas, we are aware that we drove on a rich heritage and legacy of studies, firstly, about this topic, because we can't think about the patterns of Christopher Alexander that pose a lot of figures, spatial figures that could be used in this kind of approach, or some manifold studies about peri-urban planning and design. The point is that sometimes urban policies forgot about this area. We have no, in the ordinary planning tools, we have not, yes, we have very interesting landscape design projects sometimes, but they are not, according to me, with the things that my colleague was saying, Antonella, they are not related to the real context and the real actors and practices in the field, in the ground. And so for us, the point is how we can relate, for instance, rural policies, rural development policies, tools and resources with spatial planning actions and tools. This is the point. So we have, I guess, many ideas about good equipments and accommodation, and also drawing on Benton McKay and other theories about at different scale design issues. But we need to act on policies, with policies, along with policies to really implement our ideas and design issues. Thank you.